Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip back in time and step into the shoes of one of the most misunderstood and at times controversial figures in history, the medieval prostitute. Yes, you heard that right. You're about to take a wild ride into the underbelly of medieval society, where silk gowns and church bells were as common as shady alleyways and whispered secrets. But hey, don't worry, I won't throw you in at the deep end. You probably wouldn't last more than a day. Anyway, trust me, it wasn't all wine and roses. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm genuinely curious about your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's the 12th century. Picture it: cobblestone streets, the smell of bread baking in the air, and the distant clang of a blacksmith hammering away. But beneath all that surface charm lies a darker world, one where women are hustling for a living in ways you might not expect. You might think of medieval prostitutes as the outcasts, the women who could only rely on their bodies to survive, but that's not the whole picture. These women held a position, sometimes a vital one in society, with lives that were far more complex than they're often given credit for. Let's start with how these women even ended up in this line of work. You might think that all medieval prostitutes were simply abandoned or forced into it by circumstance. While that's partly true, some actually saw it as a means of survival or even social mobility. The notion of becoming a prostitute wasn't as far-fetched as you might think. After all, women in the medieval period didn't have many opportunities for independence. Marriage was often the only viable option, and when that wasn't on the table, selling your services in exchange for survival became one of the few paths left. But of course, that didn't mean every prostitute was a helpless victim of their circumstances. Some of them made choices that weren't as desperate as you might imagine. But let's not sugarcoat things too much. Life for these women was hard. I mean, can you picture yourself on the medieval streets, dealing with the constant threat of disease, rough treatment from clients, and society's judgment? Yeah, not exactly a walk in the park. And yet, some of these women thrived in ways that would make you pause. You see, while the church was busy preaching about sin and redemption, it wasn't always so quick to cast out the women who made their living in bed. In fact, in some towns, prostitutes were given licenses to operate an official stamp of approval, if you will. These women were officially part of the economy, and their services were a crucial part of urban life. But of course, all of this came at a cost. Sure, they might have had some legal protection or maybe a little social mobility, but the stigma, that never went away. The church, still calling them sinners. Society, they were the fallen women, the ones to be pitied or worse, scorned. So, while medieval prostitutes weren't exactly starving in the street, they weren't exactly living their best lives either. You might be wondering, though, what about the clients? Who was coming to these women for services? Well, that's a whole nother story. Medieval prostitutes didn't just serve the poor or desperate. Oh no. They were often frequented by the wealthiest men in society, the knights, the merchants, the lords. In fact, some of these women were so skilled at their work that they had wealthy patrons coming back time and time again. Some even had special arrangements with the upper crust of society. It wasn't all dirty alleyways and dark corners. No, there were some who worked in more elegant settings, and their clientele, top tier. The kind of men who could have anything they wanted, but they still chose to spend time in the company of these women. Now you might think, that's all fine and dandy, but didn't these women risk catching some pretty nasty diseases? Well, you'd be right to ask. The Middle Ages weren't exactly known for their hygiene standards, and diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant. Prostitutes, unfortunately, were often the first to catch these diseases and the ones blamed for spreading them. You might be surprised to learn that, even back then, the medical community wasn't entirely ignorant of the connection between prostitutes and disease. In fact, some early medical texts even made a point of warning men against frequenting prostitutes, though, as you might guess, the advice was rarely taken seriously. And here's a little historical tidbit for you. While we commonly associate syphilis with the New World, historians still debate whether the disease first appeared in Europe after the Columbian Exchange, or if it had already existed in some form prior to the voyages of Columbus. So, yeah, history's got some unanswered questions about this whole mess, and historians still can't seem to agree on the details. But back to the point, these women weren't just surviving. They were a vital part of the economy, even if no one wanted to admit it. Without them, you could argue that medieval cities might have looked quite different. They were the hidden pulse of society, the ones who kept certain things running smoothly, even if they were never given the credit they deserved. And that, my friend, is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to uncover in the hidden lives of medieval prostitutes, and believe me, it's not all doom and gloom. Stick around for the next chapter, where we'll dive into the different classes of prostitutes and how their social standing varied. Now that we've got a glimpse into the world of medieval prostitutes, let's dive deeper. It's time to explore the complex and often misunderstood social stratification within this profession. Because, believe it or not all prostitutes were created equal. Some were right at the bottom of the social ladder, while others, well, let's just say they were living a life that most would envy. It's almost like a medieval class system within a profession that was already considered morally questionable. But hey, what else would you expect from a society that treated everything with a strange mixture of disdain and necessity? Let's first talk about the lower-class prostitutes, those who lived in the darker corners of the city. These women were usually forced into the trade by poverty, circumstances, or lack of alternatives. They often worked in brothels, typically located in the seedy parts of town. If you had to find one, just follow your nose. You'd be smelling a mix of stale beer, human sweat, and the ever-present stench of desperation. The brothel madam, usually a woman herself, would run the show, and these women were not exactly living the high life. The pay wasn't great, and they had little to no say in the matter of who came through their doors. Many had to endure rough, dangerous clients, and the threat of disease was always lurking in the shadows. But don't think for a second that they weren't resilient. These women formed tight-knit communities fighting for survival, looking out for one another in an unforgiving world. They were often skilled in street smarts and could navigate the dangerous, often violent terrain of the medieval underworld. In a way, they were survivors, holding on to their dignity while the world around them tried to tear them down. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. On the other side of the spectrum, we have what we could call the high-class or elite prostitutes. These women were the crème de la crème of the trade, often working in more luxurious settings, sometimes even living in upscale houses, dressing in the finest silks, and interacting with the wealthiest men in the city. These women had patrons who treated them like queens, and they enjoyed privileges that the lower-class prostitutes could only dream of. You might find them in the courts of kings, nobility, or even religious officials, offering more than just physical services. They were sometimes used as political tools as well. Yes, you heard me right. These women were often part of court intrigues, playing a key role in the games of power that went on behind palace walls. Imagine yourself walking through a lavish courtyard, beautiful tapestries hanging from the walls, as the finest wine flows freely. And right in the midst of all of it, there's a high-class prostitute casually engaging in a conversation with a duke or a king's advisor. You could almost mistake her for one of the courtesans, except instead of being treated as a potential bride or wife, she's very much aware of the power dynamics at play. The clever ones understood their value and wielded it as strategically as any knight would his sword. But let's take a moment to address the less than glamorous parts of this elite profession. Even though these women were technically considered higher up the social ladder than their street-working counterparts, they still had to contend with a dangerous double standard. They were often seen as temptresses, guilty of leading men astray, and even the wealthiest patrons treated them as disposable objects. It was a world of fleeting affections, and no matter how high you climbed, there was always the risk of being cast aside just as quickly as you had risen. And here's something you might not know. This hierarchical system within the prostitution business was, in many ways, shaped by medieval law and religious views. Society was quick to cast judgment on these women, but there were often convoluted legal systems in place that dictated their status. In some places, a prostitute could be registered or licensed by the church, which granted her a certain amount of protection from the law. But of course, that didn't stop society from seeing her as little more than a sinner in need of redemption. These laws, though, did provide some level of security, meaning that high-class prostitutes had more legal standing and sometimes even had the right to own property. And what about those who were neither at the top nor bottom? Enter the middle-tier prostitutes, who often worked independently rather than in brothels or courts. These women might be seen as streetwalkers, working from their own homes or on the streets without the backing of a madam or a powerful patron. They were the most visible, and yet the least glamorous of the bunch. Though they had some independence, they didn't have the luxury of the high-class prostitutes or the close-knit community of the lower-tier ones. They were often subject to the whims of society, and their lives could be just as unpredictable and dangerous. Now, this isn't to say that all high-class prostitutes lived a life of luxury and ease. Far from it. Many of them were still trapped in a system that used them as tools of political and personal power, with little room for autonomy or personal satisfaction. Some were even retired from the profession once their looks began to fade, which, let's be honest, was a brutal reality for many of these women. But what's fascinating is that despite the challenges, many of these women managed to use their status to wield influence, often having a greater role in the politics and economics of their time than you might think. In the end, medieval prostitutes were not simply victims or villains. They were women navigating a harsh and unforgiving world, each finding ways to survive and thrive in a society that often had no place for them. And as much as society wanted to put them in neat little boxes, the truth is that their lives were a lot more complex than we might expect. Let's take a step back, slow down a little, and get into something a bit more personal. You've probably been wondering how exactly one became a prostitute in medieval times. After all, it's not like you just woke up one morning and decided to take up this profession, right? Well, as it turns out, there was a process zone that, believe it or not, might involve a lot less desperation than you'd think. It's time to pull back the curtain on the training of a medieval prostitute and discover just how some women entered this complex and often misunderstood world. First off, let's talk about the choice. Yes, choice. It wasn't always forced upon them. Some women actively chose this path not out of a dire need for money, but as a way of surviving in a world where choices for women were limited. Life in medieval society was tough for women. If you weren't born into a family with enough money or connections, you were likely looking at a life of either marriage, which, let's face it, often wasn't much better than a form of legalized servitude, or domestic work. Prostitution, on the other hand, was one way to make a living without the social constraints that came with marriage or housework. But there's more to it than just choosing. In many cases, women who entered this line of work went through what you might call an apprenticeship. Now, before you start thinking of it as some kind of glamorous training program, let me assure you it wasn't. Women often learned from older, more experienced prostitutes, either through observation or by being taken under the wing of a seasoned mentor in the trade. These mentors would teach them everything they needed to know about their craft, how to entertain a client, how to navigate the social dynamics of the trade, and even how to deal with the physical side of things. Now, don't get me wrong, this wasn't some quaint, charming mentorship. The reality was much harsher. For one thing, most of the women entering the trade were young, often teenagers, and were at the mercy of older women who may not always have had the best interests of their apprentices at heart. Some of these mentors were simply trying to survive themselves and took on apprentices as a way of ensuring their own livelihood. These young women might have started in less than ideal circumstances, often having little choice but to rely on the guidance and sometimes manipulation of their older counterparts. But what about the actual training? How did they go from being young and inexperienced to seasoned professionals? Well, the basics weren't all that complicated. Prostitutes, regardless of their class, had to learn how to interact with clients in a way that made them desirable, how to charm, how to negotiate, and, most importantly, how to survive. In fact, you could say that being a prostitute in medieval times wasn't all that different from being a modern-day performer. You had to learn how to entertain, make your client feel valued, and, at the same time, maintain control of your own dignity. A fine line to walk, right? What's fascinating here is that the very nature of the profession required a certain level of skill. Prostitutes, especially those who catered to the higher echelons of society, had to possess not just physical attributes, but intellectual ones as well. They needed to be witty, charming, and adept at navigating the complex social and political terrain of their clients. This wasn't just about sex. It was about understanding the needs of powerful men, providing companionship, and sometimes even engaging in political or intellectual discourse. And here's where it gets a bit dark and interesting. Some of the more successful prostitutes, especially those in the higher class, were highly educated. They were able to hold their own in conversations with scholars, knights, and even royalty. In some cases, these women became almost like political operatives, using their connections with powerful men to influence events, decisions, and policies. Yes, the world of medieval prostitution wasn't just about brothels and alleyways. It was a world where some women found themselves in the very heart of power, all because they had the skills to navigate a world that was hostile to their gender. On the other hand, there were also women who were forced into the trade under far less glamorous circumstances. For these women, the training wasn't as much about learning the ropes from a mentor as it was about sheer survival. Some women were kidnapped or sold into prostitution, often by family members who couldn't care for them or, tragically, saw them as little more than a commodity. These women had little choice in the matter and would spend their lives in servitude to the whims of men. But interestingly, some of them found ways to gain a certain amount of autonomy over time, learning how to manage their finances, building a reputation, and sometimes even gaining a degree of respect from their peers. However, regardless of whether they were trained by a mentor or thrust into the trade by necessity, all medieval prostitutes had one thing in common. They had to deal with the constant, overwhelming pressure to survive. The physical and emotional toll of their work was immense, and yet some of these women were able to transcend their circumstances, gaining wealth and status. While we tend to view them as nothing more than victims of circumstance, it's important to remember that they were also survivors, adapting to a harsh world and making the best of it in whatever way they could. So, when you think about it, becoming a prostitute in medieval times wasn't as simple as just choosing a job. It involved skill, resilience, and let's be honest, plenty of luck. Whether they were trained by a seasoned professional or had to fend for themselves, these women had to navigate a world that wasn't kind to them, and they had to do it with a sense of wit and determination that few could imagine. All right, now that we've touched on the training aspect, let's shift our focus to something a little more luxurious. Picture this: a lavish house, candlelight flickering off gold-framed mirrors, the smell of incense hanging in the air, and music softly playing in the background. No, it's not some fantasy palace. It's the home of a high-class prostitute in medieval times, a world away from the grimy alleyways and overcrowded brothels we often imagine. These women didn't just survive, they thrived, and their living conditions were a testament to that. Contrary to popular belief, not all medieval prostitutes lived in squalor. In fact, some enjoyed a level of comfort that most of their fellow countrymen could only dream of. These high-class women, often working as courtesans or in the service of nobility, lived in what could almost be described as luxury. They had fine silks, ornate furniture, and even personal servants to cater to their needs. You could almost think of them as medieval celebrities, in the sense that they were often well known, and their lifestyles were envied by many. Of course, this didn't mean they were immune to the social stigma that came with their profession, but in many ways, they were the elite of the prostitute world. Their homes were usually in the more desirable parts of the city, far away from the crowded, dangerous streets where the lower-class prostitutes worked. These women often rented elegant rooms in private houses or palaces where they could entertain clients in comfort and style. Unlike their street-walking counterparts, these high-class prostitutes had the luxury of privacy. The rooms were often decorated lavishly, with tapestries and intricate furnishings, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity and allure. They didn't just offer sexual services, they offered a full experience, companionship, intellectual conversation, and sometimes even political influence. It wasn't just the physical surroundings that made these women stand out. Many of them were highly skilled in the art of conversation, music, and even intellectual pursuits. Imagine having dinner with a well-dressed nobleman, and instead of the usual small talk, you find yourself engaged in a deep philosophical discussion or discussing the latest political intrigue. These women were not just there to please the physical needs of their clients, they were the companions that men could turn to when they wanted to relax, let down their guard, and even show off their intellectual prowess. After all, a man's reputation was at stake too. No one wanted to be seen in the company of someone who couldn't carry on a decent conversation. But even in this world of relative luxury, there was still a darker side. While these high-class prostitutes were well treated in some ways, they were still very much at the mercy of the men who hired them. Their lives, despite the comforts they enjoyed, were still shaped by power dynamics, and their position in society was far from secure. The elite prostitutes were still seen by many as little more than tools for pleasure, valuable tools, no doubt, but tools nonetheless. There was always the looming risk that, once their looks faded or their political usefulness diminished, they would be discarded without hesitation. And let's not forget that the men who sought out the company of these women were not always the noble knights and courtiers we imagine. They came from all walks of life, including wealthy merchants, scholars, and even the church. Yes, even clergy were known to indulge in the pleasures of the flesh, and some of the high-class prostitutes found themselves entertaining those who wore the robes of the clergy. It's a little ironic, isn't it? The church, which often preached chastity and piety, was perfectly fine with the idea of paying for someone to disregard those very principles. But it wasn't just a matter of hypocrisy. For these women, it was a business. They understood the power they wielded, and in many ways, they were able to navigate the tricky waters of religion and politics with an ease that would have made many of their clients jealous. Now, let's talk about the darker side of this world specifically, the dangers that lurked in even the most refined corners. Despite the apparent luxury of the high-class prostitute's life, they were still vulnerable in many ways. Even though they might have lived in beautiful houses, they were often bound by contracts and relationships that kept them from being truly free. Many women who found themselves in these situations were either beholden to a particular client or tied to a madam who controlled their earnings and lives. The higher the stakes, the more dangerous the game. One wrong move, and they could find themselves out on the streets with little more than their reputation to fall back on. But what's perhaps even more striking is the fact that some of these women, despite being elite in the eyes of society, were still caught in a web of exploitation. Their wealth, while considerable by most standards, didn't necessarily translate into true independence. The reality was that many of these high-class prostitutes had limited agency, forced to play the game by the rules set out for them by the men in power. They might have been able to choose their clients, but in the grand scheme of things, they were still limited by the constraints of a society that didn't truly value them. And here's something to think about. The so-called elite prostitutes didn't always have it better than their lower-class counterparts. While their homes were certainly more lavish, their lives were far from simple. These women had to constantly prove their worth, both to their clients and to society. The pressure to maintain a certain standard of beauty, charm, and social grace was immense. It wasn't just about sex. It was about keeping the illusion of desirability a live-in illusion that could disappear in an instant. So, the high-class prostitute's life was a mix of luxury and danger, empowerment and exploitation. It was a world where a woman's value was tied to her ability to please and entertain, and where, despite all the comforts, she was still subject to the whims of powerful men. It was a precarious balance, one that could tip in either direction at any moment. All right, let's switch gears a bit and dive into something a little darker, but still undeniably part of the reality these women had to navigate. You might be wondering, how did these women in the sex trade deal with diseases in a time when medical science was, well, let's just say, far from advanced? Yep, we're talking about the unsanitary, disease-ridden world of medieval prostitution. A lot of people, both men and women, worked in this profession at their own peril, constantly at risk of contracting illnesses that, at the time, were not just fatal, but also highly stigmatized. Now, you might be thinking of the more famous disease of syphilis, for instance, but it wasn't just that. The reality is that medieval prostitutes had to contend with a whole host of diseases that could make their lives not just uncomfortable, but downright deadly. Let's rewind for a second. Imagine yourself in medieval Europe, working in a brothel, where the stench of body odor, stale beer, and sweat is mixed with the constant chatter of clients coming and going. The city streets are muddy, and the concept of hygiene, well, let's just say it doesn't quite exist in the way we understand it today. No soap, no clean water, and definitely no antibiotics. Just a world full of risk. And of course, it's no surprise that venereal diseases, which we now know to be sexually transmitted, were a huge issue. Syphilis was the big one, but it wasn't the only player in the game. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, and even some of the earliest traces of HIV were also making the rounds, though they weren't understood in the way we comprehend them today. The thing is, for medieval prostitutes, the risks were constant and ever-present. Men might not think twice about their health after all. They were paying for a service, but the women? Well, they were often left to deal with the consequences. Here's a little-known fact that might surprise you. Many medieval cities did have some form of health regulation for prostitutes. These were often referred to as health inspections, where the prostitutes were periodically checked for signs of illness. However, these inspections were far from the public health measures we have today. They were often conducted by a local church official or a town doctorate, you could call them that. They weren't exactly medical experts in the modern sense, so the whole system was more about control than actual care. Some cities even required prostitutes to register, and in exchange for this official registration, they were given some, barely, legal protection from being harassed or arrested. But the truth is, these women had very few options when it came to health care, and they were usually left to fend for themselves if they contracted a disease. What's even more interesting is that while prostitutes were seen as the carriers of disease, the truth is that the men who visited them were just as responsible for spreading these illnesses. In fact, some studies have suggested that syphilis, which wreaked havoc across Europe during the late medieval period, was actually spread by soldiers and sailors who then passed it on to prostitutes. It's one of those cases where historical events come together in strange, interconnected ways. In the end, it wasn't just the women who were at risk, it was a shared problem. But let's not make it all doom and gloom. Amidst this mess, some women developed their own coping mechanisms. Many of them, especially the more successful ones, would take precautions to protect themselves from disease, things like herbal remedies, potions, or even the occasional ritual to ward off evil spirits. No, they weren't exactly healthcare professionals, but they had to make do with what they had. And, interestingly enough, some of these women became somewhat of a go-to resource for others, acting as quasi-medical advisors in a world where medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. It wasn't just about health, though. You can't talk about medieval prostitution without touching on the role that religion played in shaping how these women were viewed and treated. The church, which held an enormous amount of power, had very specific opinions on women who sold sex. On one hand, it condemned prostitution outright as sinful. But on the other hand, the church also had a peculiar relationship with these women. In some cases, religious figures used prostitutes for their own personal pleasure. Hypocrisy. Anyone? The church itself was filled with contradictions. The idea of saving these women by pulling them out of the profession was one of the church's main talking points, but the reality was much more complex. Prostitutes were not only seen as sinners, but also as necessary evils in a world where sexual desire was expected to be controlled but could never truly be eliminated. And here's where it gets even more twisted. Despite all the talk of saving them, many religious figures viewed prostitutes as the perfect symbols of both temptation and redemption. These women, in the eyes of the church, were seen as living proof of mankind's fallibility, but also as potential objects of salvation. The church's contradictory stance didn't just reflect the church's own moral ambiguity, it also mirrored how society viewed these women as both a necessary part of life and a source of shame. But despite all the stigma, disease, and moral judgment, these women still managed to carve out their own identities, survive, and even thrive in many cases. It's a testament to their resilience and determination in the face of immense challenges. They weren't just the victims of their circumstances, they were the women who kept the wheels of society turning, even if no one was willing to admit it. And so, while the reality of being a medieval prostitute was grim at times, it wasn't all despair. There were moments of camaraderie, moments of rebellion, and yes, even moments of power. The diseases they fought off were just one part of a much bigger story, one that continues to fascinate and surprise us to this day. Now that we've explored the grim realities of disease, let's shift gears and talk about something a bit more intriguing. You see, being a prostitute in medieval times wasn't just about the physical act itself. It was also about the relationships these women formed with their clients. And when you think of medieval clients, you might picture drunken, rowdy men stumbling into dimly lit brothels. But the reality was a bit more complicated. Medieval clients were a diverse group, ranging from poor peasants to wealthy merchants. And interestingly, many of these women served the most powerful men in society, the nobility, the clergy, and even royalty. These women didn't just offer their bodies, they offered something more: intellectual engagement, companionship, and sometimes a bit of political maneuvering. Let's talk about the rich and powerful first, because honestly, these were the most fascinating and often most mysterious clients in the medieval world of prostitution. The wealthier clients didn't just come for the physical act. Oh no, for many of them, the prostitute was someone who could provide much more than mere satisfaction. They were companions often for dinner parties, intellectual conversations, or even political discussions. Imagine this: you're a nobleman, with all the power and influence you could possibly want. But even with all that, you're looking for something morea confidante, someone who understands the world of power and politics. Enter the high-class prostitute. These women often acted as unofficial political advisors, not necessarily through direct involvement in politics, but by offering a listening ear to powerful men. Many of these women were well educated and could hold their own in discussions on everything from philosophy to diplomacy. Their relationships with their clients often went beyond the physical realm. In fact, some of these prostitutes became so embedded in the political landscape that they could influence key decisions, especially when their clients were high-ranking officials. While not all prostitutes used their influence in such ways, many were well aware of the power they held, and they wielded it with a certain level of skill. And here's something that might surprise you. Some of these high-class prostitutes even had their own loyal clients who kept coming back, not just for their physical services, but for their wisdom, charm, and ability to listen. A nobleman might spend hours with a prostitute, not only engaging in intimacy, but discussing political alliances, family matters, or even business transactions. These women were often more than just objects of desire. They were confidants, advisors, and even emotional supports to the powerful men who sought them out. But of course, let's not romanticize it too much. As with any form of prostitution, there were still risks involved. Many of these women, even if they were treated well and lived in luxury, were still ultimately subject to the whims of their clients. They were often viewed as disposableno, no matter how much influence they may have had. Once their beauty faded or their influence waned, they could be discarded just as quickly as they had been picked up. Even the wealthiest prostitutes were rarely immune to the sharp edge of social stigma, which made their positions in society precarious, no matter how much money or power they had. But there's an interesting flip side to this dynamic: the lower class clients. You might assume that poor peasants and common folk were the only ones who sought out the services of prostitutes, but that's not the full story either. Many prostitutes worked in more public spaces on the streets or in brothels, and their clientele could range from men who were passing through town to local workers who needed a quick escape from the monotony of their daily lives. The lower-class prostitutes, while not enjoying the same luxuries as their high-class counterparts, still had their own set of advantages. For these women, the clients were often more anonymous, and the interactions could be far less complicated. There wasn't the same level of emotional or intellectual engagement as with the wealthier clients, but in many ways, it was a simpler exchange. The relationships were more transactional: a quick service, a fixed price, and then they went on their separate ways. For these women, the risk was mostly physical and emotional, as they had to deal with the dangers of violence or disease in ways that their higher-class counterparts might not have had to. But for some of them, the simplicity of the transaction could also provide a level of control. They knew what they were offering, and the exchange was clear. Now, here's a fun and somewhat surprising historical tidbit. The term sex worker, as we understand it today, didn't exist in the medieval world. Instead, there were different labels for women in the trade, and these labels varied widely depending on their client base, location, and the type of services they offered. Some of the terms used were harlot, courtesan, or even scourge of society, but the distinction between the types of prostitutes wasn't always clear-cut. High-class prostitutes weren't always referred to as courtesans, and low-class women weren't always considered harlots. The labels were often fluid, and society's views on these women were just as inconsistent. Interestingly, despite the clear distinctions between the different types of prostitutes, many of these women found ways to form alliances with each other, even across class lines. The lower-class prostitutes often provided support for their wealthier counterparts, and vice versa. There was a kind of solidarity among these women, even though their lives and experiences were so different. In a way, they all understood that, no matter their class or status, they were all working in a profession that society disapproved of, and that bond, though sometimes unspoken, was powerful. So, whether they were serving the lowliest of peasants or the most powerful of kings, these women formed connections with their clients that were often more complex than we might imagine. They weren't just there to meet physical needs, they were part of a larger social and political world, a world where power dynamics, intellectual exchange, and sometimes even emotional support played a role in the relationships they forged. Now that we've explored the complex relationships between medieval prostitutes and their clients, let's dig into something a little more subversive. Prostitutes, especially those in the upper echelons of the trade, didn't always play the victim role society expected them to. In fact, many of these women were far more powerful than we tend to give them credit for. It's time to look at how some of these women used their position in society to not only survive, but to subtly and, sometimes, not so subtly resist the pressures placed upon them. After all, every act of survival in a system that marginalizes you is an act of rebellion in itself. Let's start by acknowledging something important. The medieval period was not exactly a time of women's liberation. For the majority of women, societal expectations were rigid and harsh. A woman's worth was often tied to her ability to marry well and bear children, and anyone who deviated from that path was seen as a threat to the established order. But then there were the prostitutes, those women who, by definition, didn't play by the rules. And, while society might have viewed them as fallen, these women were experts at navigating a world that didn't want them to succeed. In many ways, prostitution was the ultimate form of rebellion. It was a refusal to conform to the narrow roles that society had set for women. And what's fascinating is that, despite being labeled as outcasts, some of these women used their position to exert a certain amount of influence, especially when it came to the men they entertained. In fact, some of them had more political sway than you might expect. You see, being a prostitute in the courts or with the nobility meant that you were in close contact with some of the most powerful men in the land. While you might think that their power was based purely on physical attraction, that was only part of the story. Many of these women understood the complex dynamics at play and knew how to leverage their relationships with powerful men for their own gain. Take the case of political influence. Prostitutes who catered to kings, nobles, or high-ranking church officials often found themselves privy to private discussions about war, diplomacy, and even local politics. While it might seem that they were simply there to entertain, many of these women used their position to gather intelligence, influence decisions, or even subtly sway the opinions of powerful men. It was like being a behind-the-scenes player in a game of political chess. These women weren't just passive recipients of power, they often played an active role in shaping it. It wasn't always about grand political maneuvering, though. Many of these women, especially those who worked in brothels or on the streets, formed networks of solidarity with other women. Whether they were working together to protect each other from violent clients or sharing tips about which neighborhoods were the safest, these women often relied on one another for support. It's a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, there was always a sense of community. Sure, they might have been seen as society's outcasts, but among themselves, they were often a united front. And let's not forget about the subtle, everyday forms of resistance. Some prostitutes used their wit, charm, and intellect to navigate their lives in ways that would have baffled those in power. These women understood the societal rules and knew how to bend them without outright breaking them. A clever remark, a well-timed flirtation, or a sharp observation during a political conversation, these small acts of defiance were often enough to assert some measure of control in a world that was designed to disempower them. It's one of those fascinating contradictions. While society may have labeled them as powerless, these women often exercised more power and agency than anyone realized. There's also something else to consider. In a society that was deeply religious and repressive, prostitution itself was a form of protest, a way of rejecting the moral expectations placed on women. The very existence of prostitutes in the medieval world was, in many ways, a reflection of society's inability to fully control desire, and that was a powerful thing. Even though prostitutes were often seen as sinners and outcasts, their existence forced society to confront its own hypocrisies. They were the embodiment of society's hidden truths, something that couldn't be easily swept under the rug, no matter how hard the church or the state tried. But let's zoom out for a second. When you think about it, the medieval prostitute was a figure of both vulnerability and power. She was at the mercy of the social system that often treated her as little more than a tool. But at the same time, she was an expert at manipulating the same system that oppressed her. Whether through intellectual engagement, political influence, or simple survival, these women found ways to carve out spaces for themselves, even in a world that had little room for them. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Historians have often overlooked these women. The lives of medieval prostitutes, particularly those who existed in the shadows of society's elite, are often glossed over in favor of more traditional historical figures: kings, queens, knights, and saints. But when we look closer, we see that these women weren't just footnotes in history. They were active participants in the shaping of medieval society, even if they weren't always given the credit they deserved. While we often think of medieval prostitutes as tragic figures, their lives were much more layered than that. Some were victims, yes, but they were also survivors, navigators, and even influencers in a world that had no place for them. And in many ways, their very existence served as a subtle rebellion against the forces that sought to control them. These women may not have worn crowns or wielded swords, but they were powerful in ways that were often invisible to those around them. It's a reminder that history is full of untold stories of resistance, survival, and power that we often overlook. The medieval prostitute was not just a victim of her circumstances. She was a player in the great drama of her time, one who found ways to survive and, in many cases, thrive. Now that we've explored the subtler side of rebellion and resistance, let's shift our focus a little and delve into the fascinating and sometimes contradictory relationship that medieval society had with religion and prostitution. The medieval world was a deeply religious place, with the church holding immense power over the lives of individuals. So it may come as a surprise that prostitutes, despite being branded as sinful and corrupt, were not always as completely condemned by the church as one might think. In fact, their relationship with religion is far more complex than we've been led to believe. Picture it: a bustling medieval town square, the sound of church bells ringing in the distance. You can almost smell the incense wafting through the air from the nearby cathedral. In this world, the church was the central authority, dictating morality, guiding behavior, and generally making sure everyone was doing what they were supposed to do. Now, consider the strange irony. The very institution that preached chastity and virtue also had a peculiar relationship with prostitution. It wasn't just about condemnation. The church had an uneasy, yet almost practical, acceptance of prostitution, particularly when it came to preserving the moral fabric of society. You see, while prostitution was undeniably considered a sin, it was also seen as a necessary evil and outlet for men's sexual desires that, according to some theological thinkers, couldn't be fully controlled. In a world where sex outside of marriage was taboo, the church understood that men, despite their best efforts to uphold piety, still had physical needs. It's almost like they accepted prostitution as a lesser evil, a way to allow men to indulge their desires without completely destabilizing society's moral order. It's a bit of a mind-boggling contradiction. The church condemns the act, but also recognizes the necessity of it. So, where does that leave the prostitutes themselves? Well, in some ways, the church's stance on prostitutes was complicated. On one hand, prostitutes were often depicted as fallen women, sinful and in need of repentance. But, on the other hand, they were sometimes also seen as potential objects of salvation. The church, in its complex moral calculus, offered them a pathway to redemption, albeit through penance and prayer. It wasn't uncommon for prostitutes to be encouraged to attend church services, confess their sins, and seek forgiveness from God. But here's the catch. While they were given the opportunity to repent, they were still marginalized. Redemption was a long and difficult process, and the social stigma they faced wasn't easily lifted. Even if they repented and sought a new life, they were often viewed with suspicion by the rest of society. But what's truly fascinating is how some prostitutes, especially those in higher social strata, manipulated the church's contradictory views for their own benefit. Some of these women used their relationship with the church to gain protection or to elevate their status. A high-class prostitute might have found favor with a church official or even with a nobleman, and used that relationship to secure a more comfortable position in society. After all, if society couldn't fully condemn you, then maybe you could use that to your advantage, right? Now, I know what you might be thinking. Wait, did the church really help prostitutes? The answer is yes, but not in the way you might expect. The church was quick to punish those who stepped out of line, but it also had a strange way of providing a safety net for those who were in danger of losing everything. In some cases, the church took pity on women in the trade, offering them a form of support that was, in its own way, an acknowledgement of their struggles. In the medieval world, where women had few options and fewer rights, the church became a haven for many women in the sex trade, giving them a kind of refuge from the harshness of society. However, let's be clear about one thing. The church's support wasn't entirely altruistic. Its ultimate goal was always to bring sinners back into the fold of the faithful. Prostitutes weren't seen as victims of society's norms. They were seen as souls that needed saving, their moral failings to be corrected. The church's support was not about empowerment, but about control. The idea was that by offering prostitutes a chance to repent, the church could reclaim their souls and maintain social order. But let's not overlook the fact that, in some ways, the church's involvement did offer women a certain level of protection, however limited. But let's take a moment to talk about something that might seem a little strange: how some prostitutes turned the church's condemnation into an opportunity for their own personal gain. The medieval church was deeply involved in all aspects of life, from politics to morality, and for many of these women, the church's moral authority was something they could use to their advantage. Prostitutes who had the ear of a priest or a bishop might find themselves with new patrons or a better position in society. The church's complex relationship with prostitution created a space where some women were able to wield power in ways that might have seemed impossible. Some even used their knowledge of church rituals and prayers to appear more pious and to gain favor with influential men. Yet, for all the ways that prostitutes could manipulate the church, they were still trapped in a system that didn't fully accept them. Even the wealthiest and most influential prostitutes could never escape the stigma entirely. The church might have offered a path to redemption, but it also kept them firmly on the outskirts of acceptable society. So, while the relationship between prostitutes and the church was complicated, it's clear that, in many ways, the church played a dual role, as both condemner and protector, punisher and savior. In the end, the story of medieval prostitutes and their relationship with religion is one of contradictions. The church may have tried to save them, but it also reinforced their marginalization. It may have provided some protection, but it also kept them on the edge of society. And yet, despite all the limitations and contradictions, these women continued to navigate their lives with remarkable resilience, using every tool at their disposal, whether it was their wit, charm, or even the church's own teachings to survive in a world that had no place for them. By now, you've seen how these women medieval prostitutes were constantly navigating a web of complex power dynamics, from the men they serviced to the church that both condemned and offered them a chance at redemption. But now let's move away from the larger institutions and dive into something a little more personal: how these women, despite all odds, managed to build a support network of their own. You might be surprised to hear that, in a society that often turned a blind eye to their existence, many prostitutes were not completely isolated. In fact, they created their own social networks, formed alliances, and even developed their own communities that helped them survive the harsh realities of their work. Imagine for a moment the medieval brothel or street corner, the dim light of lanterns flickering on a cold night. It's easy to picture these women as completely alone, isolated, vulnerable, and subject to the whims of men who could treat them however they pleased. But there's another side to the story. Yes, many prostitutes worked in isolation, but many of them found ways to form close-knit communities with other women who understood the struggles of their trade. These women, bound by their shared experiences, created bonds that went beyond mere survival. They supported each other, traded advice, and, most importantly, looked out for one another in a world that often seemed to have no place for them. It's not all that different from the support networks that you might find today in marginalized communities, people coming together to share experiences, offer advice, and simply be there for one another. These medieval women weren't just victims of a patriarchal society. They were also survivors, and they understood that survival meant solidarity. Many brothels and street-based prostitutes relied on their fellow workers to get by. They shared information about safe places to work, which clients to avoid, and how to deal with common threats like disease or violence. In some cases, this support system extended beyond just the prostitutes themselves. There were women who had relationships with the men who worked in the brothels, the bouncers, the madams, and sometimes even the customers. These men, while not always benevolent, often played a role in the survival of these women. Some acted as protectors, making sure their clients didn't cross certain lines or ensuring that rival brothels didn't try to move in on their territory. Others took a more exploitative approach, but even then, their presence gave these women a certain amount of protection, something they wouldn't have had on their own. But perhaps the most powerful form of community came from the prostitutes themselves, those who worked together in brothels and who often formed familial bonds. These women shared not just the burden of their work, but also their emotional labor. They comforted one another when a client was particularly cruel, helped each other through personal struggles, and celebrated their victories, however small they might have been. It wasn't always glamorous, but it was real. The prostitutes of medieval times didn't just deal with the physical exhaustion of their work. They also had to manage the emotional toll. But they weren't entirely alone in this. Many leaned on their fellow women for emotional support, strength, and even laughter. Yes, laughter. Even in the darkest of times, these women knew how to find humor, which, in many ways, kept them sane. Now, you might wonder how these support networks actually worked. It's not like they had formal organizations or unions like we might expect today. Instead, these communities were often informal, built on trust and shared experiences. Some prostitutes lived together in what could be considered a form of sisterhood, with the brothel madam acting as a leader or guide for the younger or less experienced women. They learned from each other, shared secrets, and looked out for each other in a world that, frankly, didn't have much sympathy for them. This sisterhood, though, born out of necessity, was also an act of defiance. It was a way of creating some sense of agency in a system that was designed to strip it away. Interestingly, this solidarity wasn't limited to just those who worked in brothels. Street prostitutes, those who walked the roads or stood in corners waiting for clients, also formed their own support systems. While their relationships were more transient, there was still a sense of camaraderie. They would often look out for one another, warning each other about dangerous clients or offering advice on how to avoid trouble with the law. They may not have had the luxury of the brothel's protection, but they still created tight-knit networks of trust, which helped them endure. But of course, not all networks were entirely supportive. In some places, prostitutes would have to compete with each other for clients. Rivalry could lead to tension, and some women might even resort to underhanded tactics to take a bigger share of the business. But even then, the competition was rarely purely hostile. The competition often stemmed from desperation, a need to survive in an unforgiving world. However, these moments of rivalry were balanced by a deeper, unspoken understanding among women. They knew that, in the end, they were all fighting the same battle for survival, dignity, and a small measure of power in a world that often denied them all three. And let's not overlook the role of outsiders, people outside the prostitution trade who also played a part in these networks. Some towns had sympathetic individuals, local healers, town officials, and occasionally even the clergy, who provided a measure of protection or care for prostitutes. These were often the people who would step in when a prostitute was at risk of being harmed by a client, or when a woman was struggling with a medical issue. The relationship between prostitutes and these outsiders wasn't always straightforward, but it did provide these women with some form of support beyond their immediate peers. The solidarity that these women shared was a survival mechanism, yes, but it was also an act of resilience. In a world that tried to break them down, these women found ways to lift each other up. They shared knowledge, resources, and, above all, empathy. In the end, it wasn't just the physical aspects of their work that defined them, it was the emotional and social networks they built to support one another. And while their communities were often ignored or stigmatized, the reality is that these networks were crucial to the survival of medieval prostitutes. They were not just isolated victims. They were women who fought back in small, everyday ways. They leaned on each other, laughed with each other, and sometimes managed to carve out a little piece of peace in an otherwise chaotic and hostile world. Now that we've explored the resilience and camaraderie of these women, let's shift our attention to an even more complex aspect of their live show: the very elite, powerful, and sometimes enigmatic role of the high-class prostitute interacted with the politics of their time. You might imagine these women as being nothing more than objects of desire, but in reality, their position in the court or the noble circles was much more than just about sex. These women wielded subtle yet significant power, often shaping political alliances, social networks, and even influencing the outcomes of key decisions. Imagine walking into a grand medieval palace. The floors are marble, the chandeliers sparkling, and everywhere you look, noblemen and royals are mingling. The food and wine flow like a river, and among them, there are a select few women high-class prostitutes who are more than just entertainment for the night. These women are playing a role that many don't fully understand, shaping the course of history in ways that don't appear in the history books but are undeniably impactful. It's not just about satisfying the whims of men, oh no. This is a world where sexuality, power, and politics intersect in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes unexpected, and often fascinating. Take a moment and think about what power is in medieval times. In a society where social standing is paramount, power doesn't just come from birthright, it can also come from influence, control, and the ability to sway others. High-class prostitutes often found themselves in the midst of this delicate web. These women were deeply embedded in the networks of power, constantly interacting with the most influential people of the time: noblemen, kings, bishops, and even military leaders. And while they may not have had official political titles, their relationships with powerful men often put them at the heart of the political machine. Let's consider some of the ways these women could influence power dynamics. First, there's the sheer access they had. A high-class prostitute wasn't just a temporary escape for a nobleman. In many cases, she was a confidant, a source of wisdom, or even an informal advisor. These women didn't simply provide physical intimacy. They became sounding boards for political figures, offering insight, asking questions, or even subtly guiding their patrons toward specific decisions. It's like being in the ear of someone who has the power to change the world, and if you know how to navigate those conversations, you can shape the direction of events. Here's a prime example. Imagine a king sitting with a prostitute, sharing a private dinner. The talk moves from the mundane to the political, alliances to be made, treaties to be signed, or an enemy to be dealt with. This prostitute, known for her sharp intellect and engaging conversation, is no passive participant. As the king discusses his concerns, she offers her own perspective, carefully chosen words that could shift his thinking or illuminate a possible solution. It may not seem like much, but in the world of politics, it's these quiet moments, these private discussions, that sometimes have the greatest impact. The power these women held was in their ability to shape men's thoughts and decisions, often in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. But their power wasn't always about intellect or advice. In the cutthroat world of medieval politics, alliances could be just as important as strategy. And what better way to form an alliance than through a personal relationship? High-class prostitutes often had intimate relationships with powerful men, and these relationships weren't just about pleasure, they were about business, loyalty, and sometimes securing favor for their families, their friends, or even their future. When a powerful man's attention was fixed on one of these women, it could mean access to resources, political favor, or protection for those close to her. A single gesture of affection could be leveraged into significant political capital. But here's the kicker. These women were often aware of their power and used it to their advantage. They were no strangers to the game of influence. They knew that their physical beauty, their charm, and their intellect were tools to be used, sometimes to get ahead, sometimes to survive, and sometimes to change the course of history itself. These weren't just passive women waiting around for a king to notice them. They were active players in a male-dominated world, using every means at their disposal to maintain their position in a system that often sought to suppress them. Now, let's not romanticize it too much. The lives of these high-class prostitutes were not without their darker aspects. They were still ultimately at the mercy of the men they served. Despite their power, they were disposable. Once their beauty faded or their political usefulness ended, they could be cast aside with little regard. These women were constantly reminded of their vulnerability, and while they may have been able to secure power, it was always precarious. Additionally, the political entanglements of these women often placed them in precarious positions. It wasn't uncommon for a prostitute to be involved in a scandal, whether it was an affair that led to political fallout or a relationship that went sour. In the world of medieval power struggles, the stakes were high, and these women were often caught in the crossfire. If a political alliance failed, or a patron's fortunes took a turn, these women could find themselves discarded, with little protection from the very forces they had once influenced. And here's an interesting twist. While many of these women were wielding power in their own right, they were also acutely aware of their status as outsiders. They were part of the elite but were never truly accepted into it. No matter how close they got to the corridors of power, they were still other prostitutes, women whose place in society was always defined by the stigma of their profession. Their power was limited, fleeting, and contingent on their ability to maintain the favor of the men in their lives. But that didn't stop them from making an impact. These women left a mark on the political landscape of medieval Europe, shaping decisions, alliances, and even the course of history. Whether through their intimate relationships with the powerful or their role as unofficial advisors, high-class prostitutes weren't just passive participants in the world of medieval politics. They were active players, navigating a complex web of social and political forces. So, while the high-class prostitutes of medieval Europe might not have had titles or official power, they wielded influence in ways that were often more effective than any crown or political office could have been. They were powerful in a different way, quiet, subtle, and often hidden from the public eye. But make no mistake, their role in medieval politics was one that shaped the course of history, one intimate conversation at a time. As we ventured into the intriguing world of political influence and clandestine power plays, let's now look at a much darker side of medieval prostitution. The label prostitute was often accompanied by a host of harsh social stigma and prejudice, but there was something even more insidious at play. Prostitutes, especially those in the lower classes, found themselves in a position that made them vulnerable to all kinds of societal and personal exploitation. And it wasn't just the men who sought their services who were problematic. The harsh judgment they faced from society, the state, and even their fellow women meant they were constantly at risk, not just of violence or disease, but of being scapegoated for everything from moral decay to social unrest. Imagine the medieval streets once more, busy, bustling, with people shouting in the market, the clamor of horse-drawn carts, and the smell of sweat and spices hanging in the air. But amidst the chaos, there are whispers about women who walk the streets, women who sell their bodies to survive. These women are labeled as fallen, sinful, or worse, evil. The stigma attached to prostitution was so deep that it wasn't just the men who used the services of prostitutes who saw them this way. It was everyone. Society had a complex relationship with these women. They were both necessary and detestable at the same time. And here's where it gets particularly dark. Prostitutes were often used as scapegoats for the problems of society. When the economy faltered, when disease spread, when things just didn't seem to be going right in a particular town or city, it was all too easy for the townspeople to point to the prostitutes as the source of the problem. It was their sin, their corruption, that had spread the plague or brought misfortune to the community. The poor, the marginalized, the women on the fringes were the easiest targets for blame, and in many cases, they were treated as the ultimate other. In medieval society, where religion and morality were tightly interwoven, prostitutes were often seen as the embodiment of moral decay. And while men might pay for their services, the social structures around them still treated them as the lowest of the low. These women might have been essential to the social order, but they were rarely acknowledged as such. Instead, they were often cast aside as nothing more than vessels for sin, without any thought to their circumstances or the lives they led. Take, for instance, the Black Death. When the plague ravaged Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, many communities blamed the prostitutes for spreading the disease. The truth, of course, was far more complicated. The plague was transmitted by fleas on rats, but that didn't stop the masses from pointing fingers at women who, by virtue of their profession, were often more vulnerable to diseases than others. They were seen as the dirty ones, the ones who were morally impure, and thus they were often blamed for bringing the plague to the cities. But it wasn't just the plague that led to this scapegoating. Prostitutes were also targeted when social unrest reached a boiling point. In times of war, famine, or political upheaval, the most vulnerable members of society were always the first to bear the brunt of the blame. Prostitutes, living on the edge of society, were often scapegoated for various problems, from food shortages to moral breakdowns. They were easy targets because they were already marginalized and excluded from the mainstream narrative of respectable society. So, when things went wrong, they were the ones who paid the price. What's even more shocking is the way that prostitutes were sometimes punished for crimes they didn't commit. There are instances in history where prostitutes were publicly humiliated, tortured, or even executed because they were thought to be the source of societal ills. During times of moral panic, such as during religious purges or witch hunts, prostitutes were seen as a symbol of the devil's work. In some cases, they were accused of witchcraft and punished as such, despite having committed no crime other than existing outside the norms of a deeply conservative society. But here's something to consider. Even though these women were blamed for many of society's problems, they were also among the first to push back against the narrative that society wanted to write for them. In their own ways, they resisted the labels that were constantly being slapped onto them. They may have been seen as fallen, but they also knew how to survive, and sometimes that survival involved quietly undermining the very system that oppressed them. For instance, consider the networks of prostitutes who would share information, protect each other from violent clients, or even help one another escape dangerous situations. Even in times of extreme oppression, these women were able to find ways to maintain a sense of agency. They didn't just accept the roles that society forced on them, they resisted, even if it was just by creating safe spaces for themselves and for others who walked the same path. It's a form of quiet rebellion that isn't often seen in the history books, but is crucial in understanding the real lives of medieval prostitutes. But let's not kid ourselves. The stigma was powerful, and the social exclusion these women faced was often brutal. Even when they tried to escape, they were still seen as dirty or tainted by the mere nature of their past. They had very little social mobility and were often relegated to the lowest rungs of society, where they could be easily overlooked or dismissed. And even those who were able to find some degree of safety or respectability, maybe through a relationship with a patron or through wealth, still carried the label of prostitute, a label that many times they couldn't shake off. So, the narrative of medieval prostitutes is not just one of survival and strength, but also of vulnerability. They were women who had to navigate a world that, in many ways, didn't want them to exist, let alone thrive. They were blamed for everything that went wrong, marginalized, and excluded. And while they fought back in their own ways, their struggle against societal scorn was never fully recognized. They were the scapegoats, the fallen women, but they were also the ones who, in the shadows of history, kept society going, often without ever being properly acknowledged for the critical role they played. And this, my friend, is the hidden, often overlooked truth about the lives of medieval prostitutes. They were the unsung heroes of their time, not in a heroic, grandiose way, but in the small, quiet moments of survival, of resistance, and of solidarity. They might have been society's scapegoats, but they were also its silent, resilient backbone. Now that we've explored the darker and more complex sides of medieval prostitution, let's step back and consider something a little more personal, the the private lives and emotional realities of these women. For so long, we've focused on the external factors, the social stigma, the political maneuvering, and the dangerous clients, but what about their feelings, their relationships? The love and companionship that they, like anyone else, may have sought in their personal lives. It's easy to assume that women in the sex trade were emotionally disconnected, only existing to serve others, but the reality is much more nuanced. Picture this. After a long, grueling day in the brothel, with a steady stream of clients coming and going, there's a rare, quiet moment. Maybe it's in the evening, and the last customer has left. The brothel is dimly lit, with the soft glow of candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. And in that stillness, a prostitute might lean against the wall, letting out a sigh, her thoughts wandering. Perhaps she's reflecting on her day, or maybe she's dreaming about something more, something that doesn't involve selling her body. Could there be love, friendship, or even a family in her future? These women were human after all. They may have been forced into a life of prostitution, but that didn't strip them of their desires for connection and affection. Some of these women, particularly those who worked outside of the brothel and lived in the streets, formed romantic relationships with their clients or even with other prostitutes. It wasn't uncommon for prostitutes to fall in love with someone they worked with, either a fellow prostitute or a client, forming bonds that went beyond the transactional nature of their work. But love, in the medieval context, was never simple, especially for those in the sex trade. For the women who worked in the brothels or as streetwalkers, love and romance were often complicated by the very nature of their profession. Their relationships were often marred by the fact that they were constantly reminded of their social status, low, dirty, and stigmatized. The idea of a true love relationship was often far-fetched in their world, where any love they experienced was intertwined with power dynamics, shame, and societal rejection. There's an even more heartbreaking side to this: the very real possibility that many prostitutes never experienced love at all. While some may have formed meaningful, if complicated, connections, others were isolated, their emotional needs unfulfilled. For them, love wasn't just elusive, it was something that might have been permanently out of reach. Imagine spending your entire life trying to form connections with people, only to be told time and again that you were lesser, that you didn't deserve to be loved because of your profession. In a world that didn't offer emotional support, these women were often left with nothing but their own company. And it wasn't just the lack of romantic love that could make these women feel alone. Many prostitutes, particularly those who had been in the trade for a long time, longed for a sense of family or belonging. They might have lost their families at an early age or been forced to leave their homes because of poverty or abuse. The street-based prostitutes, in particular, could form surrogate families with their fellow workers, creating bonds of trust, loyalty, and mutual support. But even these families weren't without their challenges. The risks of violence, disease, and exploitation were always present, and the emotional toll could be immense. On the other hand, there were some prostitutes who found ways to connect with more traditional forms of family. Some, for instance, managed to escape the trade, either by marrying or by finding more respectable work. In some cases, these women would raise children, often in secrecy, trying to shield them from the realities of their past life. There's something deeply poignant about this: women who had been cast aside by society still had the capacity to dream of family life, to hope for something different, even if it was just a fleeting vision. In fact, some prostitutes were able to use their position to forge a different kind of family of mutual support that was composed of other women in the trade. These women would help each other through difficult times, offering guidance or a place to stay when things got tough. It wasn't the traditional family structure, but it was a family nonetheless that provided the emotional strength and support needed to survive. These sisterhoods were born out of necessity. but they were also acts of solidarity, where love and care flourished despite all the odds stacked against them. And then there were those who turned to other means of emotional fulfillment. Some might have found solace in religion, seeking out the comfort and reassurance of the church, even if it was an institution that had deeply conflicted views about their profession. In a time when the church was such a central part of daily life, many prostitutes sought solace in its teachings, sometimes using religion as a way to reconcile their actions with their deeper moral beliefs. It wasn't uncommon for women in the trade to pray for redemption, to seek forgiveness, and to try and make sense of their lives in the context of faith. The desire for emotional connection didn't just stop at romantic or familial love. It was also about seeking a sense of belonging and being seen as more than just a body for hire. These women, in all their complexity, were not just their profession. They had dreams, they had fears, they had hopes for something better. The emotional world of a prostitute in medieval times was far richer than most people would assume. Yes, there was pain, loss, and loneliness, but there were also moments of tenderness, affection, and even joy. What's even more remarkable is how some of these women managed to preserve their humanity despite the harshness of their circumstances. They didn't just exist as victims or shadows in the background of medieval society. They were real, complex people who loved, laughed, and, in some cases, fought for their emotional and physical survival. It's a reminder that the lives of medieval prostitutes were not defined solely by their work. They were multifaceted, filled with complexities that go far beyond the surface-level judgments imposed by society. And while history often tries to paint these women with one broad brush, either as victims or as villains, the truth is much more complicated. Their emotional lives, their desires for love, connection, and family, make them more relatable than we often realize. They were women like any other, with the same dreams and heartbreaks, navigating a world that made it harder for them to achieve the things that everyone deserves: respect, love, and dignity. Now that we've explored the emotional and personal complexities of medieval prostitutes, let's zoom out and look at their impact on the cultural and artistic landscape of their time. Yes, that's right. The world of medieval prostitution wasn't just confined to dark alleyways and dimly lit brothels. In fact, these women, though often invisible in the historical record, played a surprising role in the cultural development of the Middle Ages. From music to art to literature, the lives of prostitutes, whether glorified, vilified, or somewhere in between, left a lasting mark on the creativity and culture of the era. Imagine walking into a grand medieval hall, the walls adorned with intricate tapestries, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and perfume. At the center, there might be a feast going on, and as the festivities unfold, bards and minstrels perform songs. You might hear a tale, sung or spoken, about the so-called fallen woman, the prostitute who seduces, deceives, or even redeems. These stories, both tragic and triumphant, were woven into the fabric of medieval culture and were often inspired by the very women who were forced to sell their bodies. From courtly love poetry to bawdy tavern songs, prostitutes and their lives became a source of inspiration for many artists and writers. The role of prostitutes in literature is perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of their cultural influence. Prostitutes were often portrayed in literature as the other, the women outside the moral norms of society. In some stories, they were depicted as tragic victims of fate, while in others, they were seen as powerful women who defied societal constraints. Take the medieval morality plays, for example, where prostitutes often appeared as figures who represented sin and temptation. These plays were meant to teach the audience moral lessons, warning them about the dangers of sexual indulgence and the consequences of vice. But even as these women were vilified, they were also given depth and complexity. showing the humanity behind the label of fallen. On the other side of the spectrum, prostitutes were sometimes romanticized, especially in the context of chivalric or courtly love. In this tradition, the prostitute was not merely an object of desire, but a figure of mystery, allure, and even power. Some of the most famous love stories of the time, from the tales of knights and damsels to the poetry of courtly love, included representations of women who used their sexuality and charm to manipulate or seduce the men around them. These prostitutes, in some versions of these stories, were portrayed not as victims, but as powerful women who wielded their sexual power with grace and cunning. In addition to literature, prostitutes also made their way into the visual arts. Artists of the time, whether working on illuminated manuscripts or painting religious frescoes, often depicted the prostitute as a symbol of temptation or sin. But these depictions were not always one-dimensional. Some of the most famous religious artworks of the time feature prostitutes in prominent roles, sometimes as figures of salvation, as in the case of the repentant sinner, and sometimes as symbols of humanity's fall from grace. This dual role as both sinner and savior reflects the complex ways in which prostitutes were viewed by medieval society, both necessary and dangerous, seductive and sinful. But it wasn't just high art where prostitutes found their way into culture. The more common art forms of the time, songs, street performances, and folk tales also reflected the lives of these women. In taverns and marketplaces, bawdy songs about love, lust, and the exploits of prostitutes were popular, often told with a sense of humor and irony. These songs, while not necessarily respectful, played a vital role in bringing the stories of prostitutes into public discourse. In many ways, these women became symbols of both the pleasures and dangers of life, objects of both mockery and admiration. Now, here's something you might not know. Medieval prostitutes were sometimes even the subject of saints' legends. For example, Saint Mary Magdalene, one of the most famous figures in Christianity, was often depicted as a former prostitute who repented and became a saint. While there's little evidence that she was actually a prostitute, the image of a woman who had fallen and then found redemption resonated with medieval society, which was obsessed with the ideas of sin and salvation. This idea of redemption was powerful, not just for religious reasons, but also for the prostitutes themselves. The very notion that a woman could rise above her past, transform herself, and achieve a higher purpose was a narrative that many prostitutes could relate to, even if it was rarely realized in practice. In the realm of theater, prostitutes were often cast as figures who could challenge authority, subvert the norms of society, and serve as a reminder of the potential dangers of excess. While some playwrights and storytellers portrayed them as tragic victims of societal pressures, others depicted them as clever, witty, and resourceful. These stories often portrayed the prostitute as someone who, while marginalized, held an essential role in society by exposing its hypocrisies or revealing uncomfortable truths. And while medieval art and literature often focused on the negative aspects of prostitution, its association with sin, temptation, and moral decay, there were also portrayals of prostitutes as women who were resourceful, witty, and, in some cases, downright savvy. These women weren't just passive figures of tragedy, they were active participants in a world that often sought to control them. Their stories, as told through art and literature, were not just about their fall from grace, but about their survival in a world that offered few opportunities for women. Interestingly, some of these portrayals were somewhat empowering. The prostitute in some tales was not merely a victim or a symbol of vice, but a symbol of resilience and agency. She was the woman who used her wit, charm, and intelligence to navigate a world that often had no place for her. And while many of these stories were still tinged with judgment, they also reflected a growing recognition of the complexity of these women's lives. The legacy of medieval prostitutes in art and literature is a testament to their lasting influence on society. They were women who, despite being marginalized, shaped the culture of their time in ways that are still echoed today. From their portrayal in religious art to their representation in the bawdiest folk songs, prostitutes were and continue to be figures who challenge societal norms, question the boundaries of morality, and remind us of the complexity of human nature. So, the next time you look at a medieval manuscript, hear a song, or read a piece of literature from that time, think about the women who were part of it all. These women weren't just the subject of the story. They were often the ones telling it, whether through art, literature, or song. They were more than just fallen or sinful women. They were complex, multifaceted individuals who helped shape the culture and creativity of their time. As we near the end of this journey through the lives of medieval prostitutes, let's take a moment to consider the larger historical context and how these women fit into the greater fabric of medieval society. We've already explored their roles as marginalized figures, their complex relationships with power, and the ways in which they influenced the culture of their time. But now, let's zoom out and think about the long-term impact of their existence, both in medieval times and beyond. Medieval society was structured in a way that left little room for individuals, especially women, to chart their own paths. There were rigid social hierarchies, with nobility at the top, peasants at the bottom, and little room for movement in between. Women were particularly restricted, as their roles were mostly confined to marriage, motherhood, or religious service. But in this rigid system, prostitutes represented a kind of rebellion against the norms. They were women who had, in many ways, carved out their own place in the world, be it a place defined by the boundaries of social acceptability. At the same time, the profession of prostitution was deeply ingrained in medieval society. It wasn't just a part of the economy, it was, in many ways, necessary to the functioning of that economy. The existence of prostitution served several purposes. It provided a release for male sexual desires that could not be otherwise addressed in a society where strict codes of chastity and monogamy were enforced. It also provided economic opportunities for women who had few alternatives. In a world where many women were either married off for financial or political gain or forced into poverty, prostitution became one of the few means for women to support themselves and maintain some level of independence. In some ways, this was a kind of system that both exploited and depended on these women. On one hand, they were seen as morally corrupt, subjects of scorn and pity. On the other hand, they were seen as essential, fulfilling a role that society both needed and hated. Prostitutes were, in a sense, trapped in this duality. They were condemned by the very people who relied on them. This paradox created a society where women, while marginalized, also held a power that was often invisible but was no less real. But here's where the historical legacy of these women becomes more profound. Over time, the role of the prostitute in society was slowly but surely pushed to the fringes. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, societal views of prostitution became more rigid. The growth of cities and the development of capitalist economies led to new systems of control over women's bodies, and prostitution became increasingly criminalized. By the time of the early modern period, prostitutes were often regarded not just as morally corrupt individuals, but as criminal elements in society. In some ways, the medieval prostitute, with her subtle influence and complex social standing, began to be erased from history. But while they may have been pushed further into the margins of society, their influence continued to be felt. The very structures that were created to control and punish them also laid the foundation for the modern understanding of sex work and the fight for the rights of sex workers today. In many ways, the medieval prostitute can be seen as an early symbol of resistance against the control of women's bodies, a precursor to the struggles for women's rights that would unfold in the centuries to come. Let's pause for a second and think about the impact of these women on today's world. While the specifics of medieval prostitution are, of course, far removed from modern sex work, the struggles of those women echo in the challenges faced by sex workers today. The stigma, the social exclusion, and the constant struggle for survival are still part of the experience for many sex workers. And just as medieval prostitutes found ways to carve out spaces of power and agency, modern sex workers are continuing to fight for recognition, rights, and dignity. The story of medieval prostitutes is, in many ways, a story of survival. These women, despite all the social barriers, diseases, and dangers they faced, managed to create lives that were marked by resilience and ingenuity. Whether through their political influence, cultural impact, or simple acts of resistance in their everyday lives, these women were not just the passive victims of their time, they were active participants in shaping the world they lived in. The fact that their stories have been largely lost to history is, in itself, a reflection of the ways in which society continues to marginalize certain groups. But by bringing these women's stories to light, we begin to understand the broader picture of medieval life, one that was more complex and multifaceted than we often realize. These women, for all their struggles and flaws, were part of the very foundation of medieval society. They were the ones who helped keep the wheels turning, the ones who quietly shaped the culture and politics of their time. So, as we close this chapter on the lives of medieval prostitutes, it's worth reflecting on their legacy not just as women who lived on the margins of society, but as women who fought against the constraints placed on them. Their stories are a reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, there are ways to survive, resist, and ultimately make an impact. The legacy of medieval prostitutes is one of resilience, rebellion, and above all, humanity. Their struggles were not just their own, they were the struggles of all women who sought a place in a world that didn't always offer one. We've covered a lot of ground in this journey, haven't we? We've seen medieval prostitutes not just as figures of sin or marginalization, but as individuals who navigated a world full of contradictions, complexities, and unexpected sources of power. From their roles in medieval society to their quiet rebellions, emotional lives, cultural contributions, and survival tactics, these women were far more than their labels. But as we finish up this tale, it's time to reflect on how we view them today and what their stories can teach us as we move forward into the modern world. The medieval prostitute, a figure often relegated to the shadows of history, still holds a powerful place in our collective imagination. In many ways, she represents everything that society wanted to hide away: sex, desire, moral ambiguity, and the harsh realities of survival in a world where women had few choices. Yet, through her, we also glimpse the remarkable resilience of women who, despite everything, refuse to be erased. She becomes more than just a symbol of debauchery. She is a symbol of strength in the face of adversity, a reminder that the system may marginalize you, but it doesn't always break you. In the modern era, we continue to grapple with many of the same issues that medieval prostitutes faced: stigma, marginalization, and, for some, a lack of agency over their own bodies. While the forms of sex work have evolved, the societal pressures and judgments persist. It's easy to point fingers at those who live in the margins of society, especially when it comes to something as intimate and personal as sex. But the lives of medieval prostitutes show us that these women were not simply passive victims of their circumstances. They were survivors, doing what they could to navigate the harsh world around them. And perhaps that's one of the most important lessons we can take from this. The medieval prostitute's story is ultimately about survival, about finding ways to carve out space in a world that doesn't make room for you. They built their own support networks, wielded power in subtle ways, and, when possible, sought out love and companionship in a world that often denied them both. Through their resilience, they showed us that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, there is still room for agency, for dignity, and for humanity. When we look at the stories of these women, we see not just victims of a rigid social system, but women who understood the systems around them, who understood that power, even for them, could be wielded in small, strategic ways. Whether through influencing a political decision, creating a network of solidarity, or simply surviving day to day, they demonstrated an incredible ability to adapt and thrive within the constraints of their time. It's this adaptability that we can take with us, whether we're facing personal challenges or trying to better understand the struggles of others. In modern society, we often think of history as a linear progression, where we move away from the mistakes of the past. But when it comes to the lives of prostitutes, especially those who lived centuries ago, it's clear that history isn't just a series of steps forward. It's full of cyclical struggles, many of which remain unresolved to this day. Whether it's the stigma surrounding sex work or the broader issues of women's rights, there's a continuity between the medieval and the modern worlds. The stories of these women are not just of a time gone by, they are still deeply relevant. And as we close the book on these medieval women, it's important to remember that their legacy lives on not just in the stories we've shared here, but in the struggles of those who continue to fight for the rights and dignity of sex workers today. The world has changed in many ways since the Middle Ages, but some battles remain the same. The fight for autonomy over one's body, for respect and recognition, is ongoing. The medieval prostitute may have been an outcast in her time, but today, the fight for sex workers' rights reminds us that their struggles are part of a larger movement for justice, equality, and respect. These women, these medieval prostitutes, are the unsung heroines of history. Their stories may have been buried in the shadows, but their resilience shines through, illuminating a path forward. They taught us that even in the darkest times, there is room for hope, survival, and power. Their influence on culture, politics, and society was more profound than we often realize, and their legacy continues to ripple through history, reminding us of the complexities and strengths of those who have been marginalized. So, as you reflect on this journey through the past, let it serve as a reminder: the people we often overlook, those we dismiss or forget, are sometimes the ones who have the most to teach us. The medieval prostitute, in all her complexity, has a lesson for us: that survival, agency, and strength can emerge even in the most difficult circumstances. And in a world that continues to grapple with issues of power, gender, and marginalization, these stories are more important than ever. Thank you for walking through this history with me. I hope you'll think about these women the next time you encounter a story of resilience or survival, whether it's from the past or the present. These women lived, loved, fought, and survived in a world that tried to keep them down, but they made an impact, and that impact is still felt today.